welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your diabolical host, Abraham.
Ooh, and I am your E-flat host, Shane. For those of you who are musicians, you know that the E-flat is just an evil-sounding chord.
We are a psychology podcast. Sometimes maybe we're a music referencing podcast. And in the month of October, we are a spooky psychology-themed podcast. And a topic that I think gets less attention than I would have thought from people who talk about the philosophy of psychology is our topic at hand today. So we're finishing up our Halloween month. We've been talking about satanically themed and Satan-leaning type topics the entire month. We started with left-hand path magic. We had Satanism, satanic cults, and now we are ending with the broader discussion of what is evil.
So this is directly from the mind of Abraham, so thank you for this one. I did my best, and I hope that I stuck the landing on the notes, because this is a big topic and there's a lot of philosophical questions in this. So
for sure,
as we kind of unpack this, you're going to kind of go, oh, okay. And then I'm just going to maybe spoil it here. We're not going to arrive on a good answer, I don't think. So, but that's okay.
That's what happens when you pick nebulous topics.
Yeah.
When I pick nebulous topics.
Yeah.
So we mostly talk about things that humans do, what animals do, and the general topics inside of psychology. And we focus those on spooky themed things, as I said. When we get to the month of October, this episode, however, releases just before Halloween. So if you are celebrating Halloween, I hope you have a safe and happy Halloween. But this does come out on October 25th, a little in advance of that, which even though it's not Halloween, it is World Pasta Day.
Yes, which I support, but also going into the spooky month that it is National Chucky the Notorious Killer Doll Day.
Oh, wild. Is this like the day that the first movie came out or something?
It's either that or the day that Charles Lee Ray possessed the doll in the movies.
There you go.
It's one or the other, but either way, just a bonus recommendation, go watch the show Chucky. It's wild.
Okay. It is also Lung Health Day.
I like that. It's National Fine Art Appreciation Day, which, if you're not an art fanatic, then you should maybe try a little bit harder.
And if you're not an art fanatic, you might enjoy that it's National Greasy Foods Day.
I like both of those things.
Yeah, so you can be both. I don't know why I had decided to segment them.
Yeah, they don't have to be mutually exclusive, especially because they are on the same day. It's National I Care About You Day, which is nice.
Yeah, and related to that, it is Punk for a Day. So being a punk, caring for other punks.
Yeah, Avril Lavigne. Stoked about this one. It's
oh god, you just really pissed off the punk community. Anyone who listens to us who's like into punk and like, what did he just say? Burn him at the stake.
I'm supposed to be subversive. That's the whole thing here.
Yeah. Oh, that was so evil of you.
It was so evil of me. Speaking of evil, like Sour Patch Kids, it is Sourest Day. One time I put 74 warheads in my mouth at the same. No, Sweet Tarts. Made my mouth raw because of that. I did it on a dare, but we should bring back warheads. Warheads should come back.
They're around. They come up in the like packs of Halloween candy that you'll get for like trick-or-treaters. There's usually like a huge segment of them that fall to the bottom of the bag.
Oh, yeah.
They're individually wrapped. So yeah.
I like that. Okay.
Warheads are on. All right. It is also Ace Week, formerly Asexuality Week. I guess that's what that stands for.
Yep.
To those ace people, I guess.
Yep. It's also Disarmament Week, which I think is pretty fitting right now.
Fantastic. Let's do that.
Let's do that, please.
International Magic Week.
Love that. It's Pastoral Care Week.
Respiratory Care Week.
And World Origami Days, which is, I feel like, a lot of fun.
Sure. There's a lot of holidays.
Yeah.
Now, as I said, we're actually talking about the concept of evil. So this is sort of a philosophy mixed with psychology. And I think that psychology is sometimes more philosophy than it should be, sometimes less philosophy than it should be, and is hopefully a balance of an appropriate level of philosophy and psychology today. But we need to start by asking the question, what is evil?
What is evil? So, as an adjective, evil is, quote, profoundly immoral and wicked. But as a noun, it is profound immorality and wickedness, especially when regarded as a supernatural force. So there's kind of to unpack in that there is this idea of being immoral, but there's also a supernatural force that is in itself evil that acts upon the universe itself.
Now, when evil is generally discussed, it is referenced as against good. So evil exists as a counterpoint to good, if you will. So to highlight the dichotomy of good and evil, good is defined as that which is morally right or righteousness.
Mm-hmm. And you may be getting some religious vibes as we go through this, and yeah, that's fair. We are going to see that as we go.
Yeah.
The word evil comes from Proto-Germanic languages, originating from the word ubelas. Over time, the word has taken a number of forms in Middle English, as evel as evil, ifel is ifel, or ufel, ufel. Old Frisian, which is spelled evel, evel. Old Saxon, ubil, ubil. Old High German, ubil. And Gothic, ubils, ubils. So there are a lot of different kind of origins for this word and how it's shaped up over time.
I could see that. That makes a lot of sense, I think.
Yeah.
All right. Now, again, we're sort of unpacking just at the beginning what the concept of evil, the definition of evil is. As a concept, it is quite broad because it applies to a wide variety of things that it could potentially be in reference to. Now, which makes this episode a little more difficult to unpack. So, to adequately touch on this topic, we're going to focus on a central idea, which is what do we really mean when we're talking about evil? And can evil be redeemed?
I think it's a fair question. So I think to start doing that, we have to figure out what types of evil exist. So there are discussions around different types of evil, and you may have your own kind of unique opinion about it. But here's what there's some agreement on. First, there's moral evil. Moral evil refers to willful acts of people. Acts like murder, sexual assault, etc. all fall within the range of what could be described as moral evil. Basically, it is something that is immoral to do or is morally wrong to do, and that's where moral evil kind of comes into play.
So it's kind of more about the fact that it's evil because it is against a sort of ethical code of guidelines we have generally adopted as a species.
Yes.
You could almost think of that as being, in a sense, arbitrarily evil or abstractly evil, but it does seem like some of these, it's not arbitrary because it's like murder, right? Like that's not
right.
That's like an actual physical, pretty significant thing. So it's interesting to call it moral evil. Said another way, those who are the arbiters of moral good are then also the ones who create the arbitrary definitions of moral evil, and as such attempt to punish what they deem as evil, right?
Yeah, so like I remember being in school and some of the local Baptist churches were really mad that Eminem was a thing that existed. And so they would take Eminem CDs and go burn them. So basically Eminem was moral evil in the face of the church, which was considered the moral good. And so like that's kind of a thing where you see that happen time and time again. We're seeing that right now with book bans, right? A lot of the book bans are because these books are considered quote unquote evil by somebody who considers themselves the arbiters of good, i.e. the Moms for Liberty and all that stuff, like consider themselves the moral good when actually they're probably the ones that are really evil.
That's absolutely true. And I was taking something a little bit different from this discussion, although I completely agree with your points, which was I was seeing this also as that the people who claim themselves to be those arbiters of good are creating the situation where then people are regarded as being evil. So an example of this, I was actually just talking about this with someone the other day, is you take something like some culture that they look at another culture that they don't like.
Yeah.
Let's take the Roma people, for example. Because they don't like them for whatever reason, they dispel them from their homes, they attack those people, and the group of people ends up being sort of on the run constantly,
right,
and trying to find places of shelter, but not really staying in one place for any too long because they're constantly being persecuted by whatever culture is the one that has the more power and the more control. And so then they're sort of demonized as being these, like, they're so wicked you can't trust them. They don't even, like, they're not responsible enough to hold down a home for a long period of time. I'm like, that's your fault.
Right.
Like, the fact that they're having to constantly move around is not because there's anything wrong with them. It's because there's something wrong with you.
Right.
But there's this tendency to literally demonize other cultures and their religions and things of that nature, because it then but in doing so, it makes you look like you are the good guy, right?
Well, right. I think that's an important point too. Like, I think I brought up an example that's clearly like, something that we're experiencing now, but like your example is something that happens constantly. Like if you think about how in the United States, we have essentially demonized communism, or like socialism in particular. Like we've considered socialism a moral wrong, but we have found that like the people that in a lot of socialist places that are not, the socialism piece isn't corrupted or whatever, like in places where it's working, it's still demonized, even though it's actually pretty effective for making sure that people have universal health care or those things. So sometimes I think it's real. I think when we talk about moral evil is coming from that space of I disagree with you, so what you're doing is wrong, what I'm doing is right, and that makes you evil to my good. When it's kind of that whole thing where the sympathetic villain, right? The sympathetic villain in a story is often considering themselves to be the good to the fold of evil, which is the person who is typically good is actually doing the evil thing, and vice versa. So it tends to be perspective-based and contextual, and I think that's a really important thing to take away. And we'll talk more about that as we kind of unpack this too.
Okay. Yeah, I would love to sort of follow that rabbit hole more, but I think for the sake of us getting through all of our content, we'll put a pin in it and we'll come back to it. Because this whole time we've been talking about moral evil, but there's other types of evil that people have sort of enumerated, and another one is called natural evil. And natural evil really primarily focuses on natural disasters such as, floods, fires, major weather events, probably hurricanes, famines.
Yeah, and so an interesting point that came up in this space that was kind of fun to explore is the idea of God. In this 1-hour psychology podcast, we're going to unpack the meaning of God. So if God is conscious and he allows for natural evil to occur, can he be morally good? And this is a question that comes up in the religious circles about moral good versus moral evil and kind of like allowing natural evils to occur. So here's the argument from a theistic discussion site that we're going to cite in our notes as well. 1, if God exists, then there exists a being who is omniscient, omnipotent, and perfectly good. 2, if there existed a being who were omniscient, omnipotent, and perfectly good, then there would be no natural evil. 3, but there is natural evil. So in conclusion, God does not and cannot exist as an idea of morally good or exist at all. And that's something that comes up as like the God problem in terms of evil in a lot of the theistic discussions. I think it's really fascinating. I fall on the side of atheist, but it is, I think, an interesting kind of discussion to unpack.
I'm a little confused at the point they're trying to make, because you said this is a theistic discussion, right?
Yeah.
Are they trying to say that God is not perfectly good?
I think that's the argument they're getting at, or that God is not omniscient, or that God is not omnipotent.
Okay.
I think basically the argument is when people go to argue that God is perfect, then that would suggest that there could be no evil, but God is not perfect. So God can be loving and be imperfect. And so that's kind of the argument for while childhood cancer exists and stuff like that, God is not a perfect being, but he does care and love and all those things.
I see. Okay, I see. So they're basically just trying to say, like, stop holding this standard. Like, yeah, sure, God is killing millions of people, but he still cares about you, or it or she.
Yeah, or it or she or whatever. So the end of that argument goes, if God were perfect and perfectly good and omniscient and omnipresent, then how could the devil have ever existed, or how could Lucifer have ever fallen? Because if God were perfect, he could have prevented that, but he didn't.
Okay.
By being imperfect, he has accidentally created evil, so on and so forth. Like, that's kind of a part of that argument.
All right. Interesting.
I think it's fun
things to think about. Yeah. No, I appreciate that. All right. So that was natural. Well, that's kind of natural evil and supernatural evil together. So we had moral evil, natural evil. The next one is physical evil. And this refers to physical manifestations of evil in the form of such experiences like pain, illness, grief, war, etc.
Yeah, so basically, like, the reason people get cancer is because that's a physical evil. Cancer itself is a physical evil, is what they'll say.
Got it. Okay.
Now, metaphysical evil, which is the more fun of the evils, refers to less tangible evils. Some of the examples includes things like birth defects, criminals going unpunished, various injustices, those types of things, which are not necessarily tangible, but they exist in the world. It's kind of when you say, that's unfair, this person got away with this thing, and they shouldn't have gotten away with it.
Okay.
That's what metaphysical evil refers to in some of the discussions.
Okay, got it. Some of the lines on these kind of bleed across one another, I think, a little bit in the attempt to taxonomize the different types of evil, but that's okay.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, just a way of people sort of philosophically trying to bin those ideas into various segments, I think, to start to unpack them. Part of the discussion within this is whether evil is an empirical or spiritual phenomenon. In both discussions here, there's always the discussion of where evil comes from,
right,
and kind of just what that means. But I think that if there was a true evil, it would be in the form of advertisements. All right, let's continue our discussion of evil after that evil break and talk about the origins of evil.
Yeah, so there's a really great example that we can use to highlight where evil might come from. And in the example described from Stanford.edu, they specifically reference Nietzsche in some of the work. There's a really great picture here called the Table of Evils, which is applied to the Nietzsche case that we're going to kind of talk about. Let's suppose a man has a history of being incredibly cruel to his horse. He has been known to physically assail his horse on a regular basis, and one day he is diagnosed with terminal cancer. So there's an empirical view of evil, but also a metaphysical origin in the idea that the cancer was a deserved outcome for beating his horse. And so that's some of the discussion is like the terminal cancer is there's an empirical way to study where the evil came from, right? Like, this is how cells work. This is how cells mutate and turn into cancerous tumors and all that stuff and become a problem. There is that piece, but then there's also the metaphysical part, which says he got that because he was a jerk to his horse, right? And so if we unpack that origin of evil, there are essentially two places where evil comes from.
Okay. In some discussions, there are three.
Yes.
We've sort of alluded to these: natural, moral, and then spooky non-agential.
I love spooky non-agential.
Yeah. They're being agent, so non-agent or non-agential.
Yeah.
And we're already familiar with the natural and moral, so let's unpack this new fun one, the spooky non-agential origins of evil, which argues that evil and evil outcomes are directly linked to dark supernatural forces. Ooh.
That is the best. So essentially what we're saying here is if we're talking about these three generalized origins of evil, natural evil comes from a place of like things happen, like natural disasters and stuff like that. Moral evil is like the behavior of people with the intent to harm others. And then spooky non-agential means that like some dark force is just mean to people. And that's kind of the part here that I really like. So if we look at the mean horseman scenario and kind of take all that, so we can look at that as the kinds of evil, right? Metaphysical and empirical, and the origins of evil, natural, moral, and spooky non-agential. The metaphysical part says that from a metaphysical, natural origin is that the coachman and the horse, it's all based in nature. So even though there is no justice or that there maybe is justice, the evils come from a natural place. Where the moral piece is that the cancer is a result of his damage due to his nature and that of his species. And so ultimately it's based on the facts about his immoral acts. Like, so he was engaging in immoral acts. So he was, as a result of that, given cancer from metaphysical places because he was immoral. But the spooky non-agential just basically says that there is an evil entity that gave him cancer. Some dark force gave him cancer. The shadow side principle in reality gave him cancer because that's what spooky non-agential evil does.
Okay. Now, if we try and then break that down, so that was all the metaphysical piece, right?
Yes.
That you were talking through.
The three different origins through a metaphysical lens.
Right. Now, there is the empirical lens also, so we'll go through the same three, the natural, moral, and spooky agential. So in the empirical version of this, I think it breaks down essentially just saying that the ultimate explanation consists of just the process of natural things that happen.
Yeah.
People get cancer. People do bad things or they do things that are aggressive toward other creatures and other beings. Now, the moral evil inside of the empirical lens is that the explanation of the suffering of the horse comes from the man's immoral acts and intentions, right?
Right.
Essentially, he's doing immoral things. And so that's why they're suffering. And then the spooky non-agential is that the cancer, the anger, the cruelty, and the suffering of the coachman and the horse, again, it really just comes down to the facts about dark force or shadow side principle in reality.
It's a fun discussion to kind of unpack all these things, but at the end of the day, it's still very unclear. Those borders are not quite as clear as we would like them to be.
Yeah. like most things, or so many things at least, it once again comes down to simply how you choose to define it. That will be a huge factor in terms of how you try to unpack it. So what evil means depends on what you mean when you say evil.
Yeah, exactly. And speaking of that, there are other theories of evil as the origins of evil and stuff like that I think are worth discussing in this space. First, there's the absence theory of evil, and this has its roots in Platonic ideas of evil, where there are varying, quote, degrees of being. And essentially, in the absence of creation and perfect good, evil must occupy that space. And this boils down to the idea that all of us have a little evil in us, right? So we can't be all good, we can't be all evil. It's kind of a spectrum where we all have a little bit of that as well as a little bit of good, hopefully mostly good than evil.
I see that sort of, there's a concept called horror vacui that is essentially nature abhors a vacuum. And so where there's empty space, it gets filled with something. And that feels like that is part of the idea here, is that like wherever there is not actual good, evil then will fill in the cracks.
Yeah. Thanks, Plato.
That's taking, I think, a lot of liberties with the idea of both space and concepts such as evil and good and how those fit inside of our natural understanding of the world. But that's okay. We'll set that aside.
Yeah. I just listened to something that talked about like how the universe is just full of miniature black holes.
Okay.
And like that occupies a lot of time and like a lot of space, and that like they're not powerful enough to do anything, but they're miniature enough to exist and fill like empty space and space. And that is I don't like that feeling. There is like miniature black holes that could pass through the earth as well. Like that's a thing that could happen.
Huh. Weird.
Don't like it.
That's fun.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, where I was going was a matter theory. So this posits that anything that is unformed matter is the furthest from goodness. So as a result of being non-created, unformed matter is evil by nature. So I guess what I'm hearing in this is that the idea that unless it seems to have a sort of evolved or created direction or niche, then its lack of niche and direction makes it evil. So whatever sludge you have left over from making like dinner that doesn't have evil. A purpose, that is evil. It is evil sludge now.
Well, it's kind of, the way that I read that is kind of like order is good and chaos is bad, right? Like that's kind of the way that reads, you know?
Yep. Yeah, that is exactly how I hear that.
That's probably a gross oversimplification. So for any philosophy major that's listening to this that wants to talk about it, please write in, because I know I'm not a philosophy guy, not really to that degree. So feel free to reach out and let us know how wrong we are on that.
Fair.
There's also privation theory, and this rejects matter theory on the basis that God created matter, so matter cannot be evil. So basically, where it says, like, whether it's unformed or formed, it doesn't matter. God created it, so it can't be evil. Instead, this leans into the idea of absence theory, where basically where there is no goodness, evil occupies. But goodness is relative to a thing's kind, which then also means that, humans can be good and evil, but axolotls can't. I mean, they feel like they're mostly good.
Yeah. They're definitely good. And then there's the real property of LA or something. Just kidding. Trying to make a Real Housewives joke. This theory argues that evil is a type of reality and is an inherent feature of finite beings. Good and evil are both interlocking realities that fight for supremacy. So it's just that evil's just there. It's part of things. Sometimes evil is victorious, sometimes good is victorious, but they're both coinciding and at battle at all times.
It's a infinite war of good versus evil. But there are other philosophies from different cultures that we wanted to kind of pull in as well that I think are going to be really important to kind of show that this is not a unique discussion to Americans. I feel like Americans should talk more about evil and how maybe we do some evil things and maybe kind of self-reflect a little bit, but that's neither here nor there. So let's talk about Chinese moral philosophy, or Confucianism, or Taoism. So there is no direct analog in how good and evil interact or oppose each other in the space. Essentially, the primary concern within this is that behavior toward the learned or superior man and evil corresponds to wrong behavior. So essentially, it kind of gets into the idea of moral good and moral evil, but it focuses on the superior or learned man as opposed to those who are quote unquote lesser. That would be like people who are unlearned, people who are more animalistic is what they might say. Maybe those who are closer to, let's say, like they don't really get into anything other than the learned man being like somebody who has a lot of education. So that's kind of the way that they unpack that a little bit.
Interesting.
Yeah.
In European philosophy, Baruch Spinoza had two thoughts on this. One, so I'm sort of reading from his perspective, by good, I understand that which we certainly know is useful to us. And two, by evil, on the contrary, I understand that which we certainly know hinders us from possessing anything that is good. End quote. So basically, good is what is not evil, and evil is what is not good, is how I read that.
Yeah. So weird that somebody landed on that same thing with a lot of flourish. Like they gilded the lily on that one for sure.
Yeah. Up is up because it is not down, and down is down because it is not up.
Yes. God. It makes me laugh because I feel like that happens a lot with like a lot of European like philosophy and stuff where like they just kind of cite things that other cultures have said much better and more thoughtful. And it's just kind of surface level where it's like, if this comes out of England, then they're just basically saying like, yeah, we love spices. And then they just salt things instead of like, stealing spices from other people, which they also do. They're just stealing ideas is what I'm saying. And their original ideas are just kind of surface level is what I'm saying. So take that, England.
Was it England or?
I'm just taking shots at everybody.
I thought you took out all of Europe, but maybe it was specific to England.
I mean, I have a particular feeling towards England, but also, yes, I'm taking out all of Europe there too.
Okay.
Now, the Bahal faith argues that evil is simply the absence of good, harkening back to absence theory. So you kind of see that happen within that particular faith.
In Christianity, it is not as simple as the devil, although the devil is often hailed as the archetype, the bearer, the harbinger of evil, etc. Evil is essentially any opposition to God, even though, as we've learned, God is apparently fallible, not omnipotent or omniscient, or at least is complicated and not that good at their job.
Hopefully you're listening to this episode and not having a crisis of faith, but if you are, we're here to support you because we are a psychology podcast and we're good at counseling, maybe.
Yeah. We're not trying to be evil.
We're not trying to be evil. Yeah, that whole thing. So in ancient Egypt religion, like religious practices or kind of spirituality, evil was described as isfet or disorder and violence. And this was in direct opposition to Maat, it's spelled M-A-A-T, which was order. Ifset was embodied by Apep, a serpent god who regularly attempts to kill Ra, the sun god. And I would like to say something here. I think polytheism is way cooler than monotheism. When you get into Egyptian mythology and Greek mythology and Norse mythology, it is so much more fun in terms of storytelling. Like, okay, so you've got Job who lives in a whale's belly. That sounds really neat, okay? But do you have Odin, who has an 8-legged horse? No, you don't have that in the Bible. So, Christians do better, is what I'm saying. Get more creative.
Or other monotheistic religions.
Yeah. How great would it be to live in a world where you believe that a serpent god was trying to kill the sun all the time? Like, that feels like it makes things a little bit more urgent.
It must have made eclipses feel very scary.
Oh my God, yesterday they probably would have lost it.
Yeah.
The Ring of Fire, they were like, Apep, no!
All right. We do need to actually talk about psychology at some point, but first, pause, ads. Okay, we're getting now to the point at which we have a little bit more to say about this. We're still sort of unpacking what others have said in the history of this and all of that. And I think that that's probably what most people would rather hear than our opinions.
Sure.
But we'll get into, I think, a little bit more of the psychology aspect of this. We're a psychology podcast. Humans are obsessed with evil behavior to a degree, or at least talking about it. So we thought it'd be worth unpacking a few famous psychological things about evil and what others have said about them.
So let's talk about Carl Jung the Dream Master, as I like to call him. He was obsessed with the shadow side of humanity. He believed evil to be a part of the mental processes of the severely disturbed. Throughout his career, he began to view evil as a moral choice. And basically, evil was something that individuals were able to reflect on and change within themselves. So I think there's something cool to be said about self-reflection within that. It's kind of a fun discussion there.
Sure. Yeah, I think charitably what we can take from that is, as you said, the utility that can come potentially from some amount of self-reflection. And we'll talk more about, I think, processes that are important to unpack there, but that's okay. Let's talk about the Stanford prison experiment for like the 5th time on the show. Zimbardo's experiment in the And the nature of evil worked a little too well. So the idea here was that people could engage in evil behavior as part of a collective identity and social influence. If you're unfamiliar with the episode, go back and just pick an episode at random. You might hear it. Although we have talked about it more explicitly, particularly, and I know in the ethics episode that we did, we talked about this, but maybe we'll do an even like full breakdown episode on it. But for now, the experiment was supposed to be a 2-week experiment. Participants were in a pseudo prison where some were given arbitrarily the role of guard, some were given arbitrarily the role of prisoners, and simply the guards were instructed to not let prisoners escape. And although this was meant to last 2 weeks, it ended after 6 days after the researchers found that the guards were engaging in highly dangerous and abusive behavior toward the prisoners.
Yeah.
It was not a good time.
Not a good time. And we've also talked about the Milgram experiment as well. This is another very famous one, but this was a study that I think it exemplifies how evil can be shaped or influenced. This was aimed to explain how people were so easily able to join in on the quote-unquote evil behavior. I say quote-unquote evil because evil is subjective, but the really terrible behavior that people engaged in during the Holocaust. So basically, they were trying to figure out how people could join into something that they believed was evil behavior. Right? Like they think this is wrong. How could they join the Nazis? Mm-hmm. Just to be clear, Nazis are bad. So the experiment required participants to shock another person, quote unquote shock. They weren't really shocking anybody. They got so far as participants being led to administer lethal levels of shock to others with enough influence. Like basically somebody in a white coat was able to convince them to deliver that higher level of shock to the point where they could possibly kill somebody. They weren't actually shocking anybody, but the idea was there.
We did a full episode, I believe, breaking down this experiment, or it was at least we use this experiment a lot because it was the I was just following orders episode that we did. Mm-hmm. So there's more about that there. But let's talk about who is evil.
Who? And so I think this is a question that we're always trying to look for, right? Like, because I think we all want an easy answer. Who is the evil person in the scenario? According to scientificamerican.com, quote, to be truly evil, someone must have sought to do harm by planning to commit some morally wrong action with no prompting from others. Whether this person successfully execute his or her plan is beside the point, end quote. The way I read that is that evil requires intention and no undue influence.
Okay. That'll be important, I think, as we get through this. I think we're getting into the meat of it now. So to be evil is to do an evil thing intentionally. I think we can follow that logic if we want to, again, ignore fundamental attribution error or contextual views of psychology and science. Mm-hmm. So essentially, if you are evil, there is no redemption because you are. Evil is as evil does. But even more strict religious doctrines have trapdoors for this, right? Isn't that what all those Catholic priests are doing in confessionals?
Got him. See, we're taking on Catholicism. We're taking on all the things right now. I think, to be fair, the idea of being evil and doing evil things are separate. And we have talked about that ad nauseum, right? Like we've talked about that through the fundamental attribution error. We talked about through just like understanding what behavior is. So this leads to other questions about defining who is evil, though. So if someone is evil, does it ever matter how much good they do? An evil person doing good deeds is still evil. Does it matter how much evil they do? How do we quantify how much evil someone does? Is it like one of those fundraiser thermometers that explodes after you're Hitler? Like, I don't know what the level or threshold is to just kind of never come back from it. But, when you're starting to unpack this, that's the thing that humans struggle with. Somebody did something really terrible, and they're always going to be known as that person that did the terrible thing. And so at what point in time do we get to redeem that person?
Yeah, if ever.
If ever.
And, I think about even people who do something that is sort of in the heat of the moment, heightened emotions, and they do something that ends up being excessively aggressive or someone else gets hurt. They would, in most circumstances, never do that. And as the trauma from that, they would never do it again. But they sort of get the brand now. You've done this thing. You are evil. Wear this brand for the rest of your life because you shall not be redeemed. I think is how a lot of people see it.
Right.
The question of who is evil is uniquely biased and unfair question for a few reasons. And one of those is we really can't measure intent. We don't necessarily know what people's intent was. Only the circumstances in which you can measure intent is if a person who has has the intent is willing to verbalize their intent. And even then, what they're verbalizing is something that, again, is being influenced by something else.
Right.
Whether they've been coerced or whether maybe they do believe that was their intent, or maybe their changes, like our memories are fallible. We've talked about that. So someone who would be evil would likely be less trustworthy by association. So how can you trust their sort of verbal statement about their intention, right? So I think even with intention, we don't know necessarily what intention was. It's hard to determine that. And I think it sort of leans toward the idea of what is motive, meaning what were they trying to get out of this as a way of thinking about it. But it does start to, I think, introduce some gray area to it.
Right. Now, the second thing is, if somebody is evil, it's because they are deemed evil by some moral authority. Scientists who believe the Earth orbited the sun were considered evil by anti-science communities and religious organizations. I mean, which are, kind of the same thing. But I think that it's important to know that the moral authority, the arbiter of moral good, can label somebody as morally evil, and as such, that person is evil, even though they are probably on the right side of history.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, we've seen that time and time and time again. We continue to see that exact problem, is the people that think that they're the good are the ones that deem the other, the outside group, the out group, as evil.
Yeah. And then, of course, history is held in the hands of the textbook writers. So,
right.
We have the narrative and interpretation we get. And I know that at least one aspect of conquering nations, when they were particularly angry at their subjects, that they knew was an effective strategy would be to try and erase that culture from all history.
Absolutely.
And although I think most of the time they were unsuccessful, we'll never know about the times that they were.
Exactly.
Because there's no record of it. There have been people who have been completely lost to history because others decided that they wanted to punish them. And while they may have thought of themselves as the good, punishing that culture for being evil, and just hearing that description, we might hear it and say, wow, those people were evil. And that's kind of the point, right? Is that there is this, like, those who choose to be the arbiters of this are probably, they're looked at by evil as being evil by someone else.
Right.
So, sorry, we were sort of talking about the few reasons why it's difficult to even identify who's being evil here. And again, the measurement here is a problem, because we're dealing with just arbitrary hypothetical concepts here, and there's no way to quantify or measure those. Either it's contextual, metaphysical, natural, or the absence of good or something. There's no universal definition, so there's really no way of like, if we can't agree on what it is, how could we determine how often and to what extent it occurs?
Right. And the problem is that the community at large wants an answer. They want to know why people, quote unquote, do evil things, but they're asking, I think, a different question. There's maybe a way to explain why a serial killer might do something and why we might consider that thing that they have done evil, but we're not asking, like, why are they evil? We're asking, why did they murder 15 people? And so I think that that's a different question framed in a way that people want to say, well, this person's evil. Jeffrey Dahmer's evil. Why is he evil? Well, okay, maybe you can say he's evil, but, like, we want to understand why he did the things he did.
And saying the why he did it was because he's evil means that we now have no actual information that we can get. Like, if we stop there, we never learn about things that we can do that could prevent someone else from doing that in the future.
Exactly. Now, and the last thing I think that's important to kind of ask when we're asking who is evil, being evil and doing evil things are both subjective things based on current moral standards, and it's important to know that they are two separate concepts. Being evil is basically saying this person is a particular thing. They have a particular personality trait. They are a certain way. And because they are a certain way, there's no way to get away from that. But on the other side of that, doing evil things still requires a contextual definition based on the moral context of the time. So both of those things are going to change over time as a result of current standards, current practices, and whoever's in charge. And I think that's kind of like where I keep landing on this, is that it really depends on who's responsible for, or whoever's in power at the time.
Yeah, who's pointing the finger.
Yeah.
Because that'll tell you a lot about what's going on.
Right.
But anyway, we do have some studies on this, which is always good. We want to pull those in. From Martin and Olson, 2015, struggles to capture whether pro-social behavior, such as helping, sharing, etc., in young learners is either intrinsically or extrinsically motivated. Presumably, intrinsically motivated is good and extrinsically motivated is complicated.
Yeah.
maybe good, but possibly bad. The question is, are children evil and need to be taught good behavior, or are there motivations that make them less less good. And spoiler alert, they don't arrive at an answer in this particular study. And that kind of is understandable given what we've already talked about. They say, quote, children's pro-social behaviors may be driven by multiple motivations, not easily captured by the idea of intrinsic or extrinsic motivation, and may be selective quite early in life, end quote. And I think that's exactly right. That's very astute, is that we want to point to everything and say, because of this thing, but I'm like, it's actually because of like 10 different things. Like they did this thing. They did this thing as an outcome of many confluence of factors that came together just at the right time to have them behave in this way. And some of those were like, there was some amount of impulsiveness possibly, but like we also like understand who taught them what values they brought to that situation. What were the values that they were taught? What were the circumstances? Like they had to be in the situation so they could make a choice to behave the way that they did in the first place. So there's like all kinds of things to consider. And without having a really concrete example, I feel like I'd speak too abstractly, but I'm hoping people are following what I'm laying down, you know?
Yeah, I think I follow that. Now, Webster, Vesturia, and Saussure in 2021 found that a belief in pure evil can actually be limited to critical thinking skills. So basically, what they're saying is if you lack critical thinking skills, you might more likely believe in pure evil. So in the study, they provided an article about a mass shooting, but changed key characteristics about the shooter. In some articles, the shooter had a brain tumor that caused the shooting, while other articles, the shooter was described as evil. Regardless of the conditions, though, those who had a higher belief in pure evil or like a supernatural evil type of situation, they held the shooter more liable regardless of mitigating evidence. Regardless if there was some kind of brain condition that prevented them from making certain decisions, they held them to the same, if not a more stringent moral standard if they believed in pure evil.
Now, I think a final thing on this before we sort of, I think, get to what I would consider to be our conclusive take-home point thesis type thing is thinking about like under what conditions do we describe something as being evil? And I think that the easiest way to, or the cleanest initial starting place is understanding that when we call something evil, it's because we have some sense of injury or offense. Like we're in a situation where we are upset or we see someone else who is upset. Something has happened where someone was harmed in one way or another. They were cheated out of money. They were physically harmed. They got some disease. They were subject of a natural disaster. They were subject to a terrorist attack. Like whatever it is, the situation is harm was done or happened in some way. Right. So I think that's an important thing to consider is that like we don't just use evil to talk about everyday things. We only use it to talk about in situations where harm was done. Okay, so if that's a relevant piece of this, then understanding why when harm is done, is there utility in calling something good or evil? And I think it does come again once again back to the idea of do we need evil for there to be such a thing as good? I think that you can honestly have, in my own mind about this, a baseline of neutral where things skew better and things skew worse.
Right.
And good, I think, has a lot of baggage to it that is not inherently linked to the opposite of good. Right. It just means that like it moved toward more helpful. So again, if we think about the conditions under which we call something good is often when someone benefited from something in some way. And the fact that they benefited did not mean that they had to have overcome harm. And that's why I think that those are not like I don't think there's a really clean dichotomy there. And one other point of just that is that because these are just words, like I can say up is down, and you follow the words that I say. You understand them if you speak the same language I do, because words don't have any inherent properties, and so you can kind of choose to invoke good or evil at whatever will you have. And really then the conversation becomes, what do we get from that? Like, how does the word evil help us in any way? Which I think really brings us to our final question is, do we need the concept of evil?
Right. And so before we unpack that, we have to ask the question, do we need ads?
Okay, we're back. Did we need those ads?
Who knows?
I mean, maybe the answer to that is also found in do we need evil, since there's so much, the Venn diagram is so overlaps. So
it's a perfect circle. Ads and evil are a perfect circle on the Venn diagram.
All right. As we were putting together the notes for this specific topic, and actually all credit goes to Shane on this one. Shane, you were the architect here, and you've done a fantastic job. I appreciate it.
I try.
But we had the thought that many other folks probably had. I like to think of myself as original, and Shane, you like to think of yourself as original, right? And all of our listeners, they like to think of themselves that way. This brought the question of whether humans need something or someone to be evil as a unifying idea. I think this was popularized by some politicians of like one way of uniting the people you have underneath you in support of you is to have an evil that they can be mad about.
Yeah, a common enemy.
Yes, we want a common enemy. And like there are other ways to unify people, I think. Well, not even I think, like there are other ways to unify people, but they chose to believe that the best way to unify people was to have them believe that we have a common enemy. And that's where we see during wartime, you have seen a lot of people who are typically opposed to one another politically come together all of a sudden.
Right.
And it's because of there being a common enemy. And I think that's kind of sad, personally, and also unnecessary. And the question becomes, can we exist in a world where evil doesn't exist? Can we thrive in this space? The essential question is whether we need evil for good to exist.
Right. And so some psychologists have actually talked about this. William James, former episode subject, actually believed that people were either healthy-minded or sick souls. And those who were healthy-minded were more likely to ignore or cope with evil existing, whereas those who were sick-souled were more susceptible to evil's whims. So there is kind of like a discussion even within the psychology space of like, well, people who are healthy are not going to be or do evil things, but people who maybe struggle with stuff are going to do evil things, which, is a problematic perspective in itself.
And as we mentioned, Carl Jung believed less in a sort of universal cosmic evil, but instead in a personal evil, which manifests as a result of negative childhood experiences. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it's not way off base there. We definitely see that in the vast majority of cases where someone is arrested for some violent crime, that person also had a history of trauma in their past, often when they were children. So not to say that is going to account for 100% of cases, but it accounts for a lot more than you might think.
Right. Absolutely. And then Gordon Allport believed that in the religious space specifically, belief in whether people were generally good or evil constituted a shallow interpretation of the human experience, which I agree with that as well. But the thing that I think is important to unpack in all of that is none of these people asked whether we needed it or whether evil is even necessary for the existence of good. And I think that is something that we continue to struggle in debates with. It's like, do we actually need evil for there to be this kind of objective good in the world?
Another way I would phrase this is, I think when we're also thinking about when we call something evil, we essentially are saying that, like, because you go back to the intention piece, right? Like they did this evil thing that they did. And most of the time we're saying that they did it because they wanted to cause harm.
Right.
Their motivation, their intention was to harm other people. Potentially, there might be an aspect of this where it was like reckless harm. They were being careless, and that makes their actions evil because of how bad the harm ended up being, potentially, or something of that nature.
Right.
But the thing is again, this often comes down to who's pointing the finger. In all circumstances, all people, when you look at their behavior, even if they know that they made a mistake, they will sort of look at this in terms of like, I also know why I did this. The fundamental attribution error thing.
Right.
Everybody did something for a reason that to them seemed like a good idea at the time.
Right.
Even if it's selfish, like they're like, I can get away with this, or like, I need this. There's some kind of justification in there. And so the idea of evil assumes that people's motivations are simply to do harm. And I think motivations, first of all, are never that simple. And second of all, it's when you consider the contextual features that influence people's behavior, verbal, their language, their values, their culture, their circumstances, the thing that immediately preceded where they're currently at, their access to things such as weapons, etc. If we're talking about like physical harm, which isn't always the case, or their access to a computer if they're, leaving evil comments on YouTube videos. Not that I have an experience with that. It all comes back to like, there are all these circumstantial things that are going on. The circumstantial view of understanding behavior, I think, makes evil an unnecessary concept because it does not further the conversation. It does not further analysis and understanding of their behavior. And like, I think a lot of people want to say like, people do bad things. And I'm like, yeah, fine. That they do things that I think they cause injury, they cause harm. Sometimes they do it for selfish reasons. Sometimes they feel justified. But whatever the thing that's going on is, like, those things happen and someone suffered as a result. And calling the evil doesn't further the conversation. That doesn't make anyone feel better. That doesn't make anything work better. That doesn't give us any solutions for how to prevent that harm in the future. So I think that it's just a derelict term that doesn't help us. And again, because language is so arbitrary, like, I think we can quite easily have good without evil, particularly, as I said, if we frame it in terms of the conditions under which we think of good or benefit and the conditions under which we think of evil or harm. One does not entail the other. You don't need to have harm to have like missed an opportunity for good. You don't need to have good to have a missed opportunity for harm. So I think that they can be separate.
That's probably my thesis at the end of this, right? Like a better way to frame the question about evil is really more in this idea, and you kind of mentioned it before, like, is what I'm doing helpful or is what I'm doing harmful? I think in that space, if you have the ability, the cognitive ability to, or like even the insight or the wherewithal or the self-awareness to take a second to go like, oh, I can be self-aware enough to recognize this, like that what I'm doing is harmful, or I can self-reflect and go, what I did was harmful and I need to correct that. I think that's a better way to frame it, because that doesn't necessarily mean that, like you said, being helpful doesn't mean that you didn't cause harm. Like, they're not mutually exclusive per se, but you always kind of want to move in the direction of being helpful. And so I think regardless of good and evil, whatever that is, I think framing the question in terms of helpfulness is way more useful for advancing society and way more effective in reducing the power that evil, the word evil holds on certain behavior or personality types.
Yeah. And so I think, if people want to create a definition of evil that makes it so logically it does exist, fine, I guess, and if people hear this and want to be righteously justified in being angry at someone else, like, I hear you, like, it feels like it is frustrating when people do things that seem like they are harmful for the sake of being harmful. But no, that's never like the exclusive reason anybody does anything is for their sort of one motive.
Right.
And it seems like almost nobody ever does anything just to be harmful. I think that they get other things out of those situations often.
Right.
Sometimes they stir the pot because they don't like what's happening on some other side of things, or they feel left out of the conversation, or they feel like they've been slighted or abused in some way, or because they're looking for a target of their aggression that was created under some other circumstances. It's very, very complicated. I think that there are no such thing as actually evil people, and that people do a lot of horrible, terrible things that cause a lot of harm in places when that harm could have been mitigated or avoided altogether if they had taken some other path. So whether you choose to call that evil or not, again, to me, it comes down to whether that label furthers the conversation. And I think, take home point here, the argument of evil, the origins of evil, good versus evil, are philosophical debates, and they're fun to have. And like but that's kind of what it comes down to, is like, we just sort of talk about talking, and they rely on established moral expectation and comparison to whatever that expectation is. And so it's comes down to, as you mentioned before, who's pointing the finger, who's the person who is authority, who's the one who's calling something evil or not. Like, that's where you're going to find more information about what they're thinking of as being evil. But if you look on the person who they're pointing at, they would look back at the person who's pointing the finger and say the same thing.
Right.
So it just comes down to opposition, and neither side being good or bad or wrong or right. It's just complicated.
Right. I think this discussion is happening more in religious circles than anywhere else. I don't think it's happening quite as much in the science or psychology world.
Yeah, that's true.
Because it is a moral and philosophical debate, it's happening more in those circles. And it's usually characterized by a binary argument, right? It's either good or evil. It's not good and evil, or equal parts good and evil, or, like 90% good, but like 10% evil. Nobody's doing that. Like, it's usually like, this is evil, this is good, period. And they kind of lay it out like that because people like binaries. But in the world of psychology, it's way more complicated, because we're talking about prosocial behavior and what's helpful. We're talking about psychological processes, self-reflection. We're talking about as William James mentioned, the idea of sick-souled people or whatever you might want to call it. It's a really complicated discussion that requires a lot of nuance, a lot of practiced kind of investigation around this. And it's not necessarily answering the question of what is good and what is evil. Like more questions around why people do what they do.
Beautiful closing. I mean, I may as well just let the advertisers have space for a minute to rest on the laurels of that beautiful closing right there. So we'll be right back. As we're wrapping up here, I just want to let you all know if you would like to tell us something that we said that you'd like to comment on, positive or negative or evil or good about any of it, you may reach out to us directly by emailing us at info@wwd.wwdpodcast.com. We're also on all the normal social media platforms, so you can reach out to us there. If you'd like to support us, you can leave us a rating and review. You can leave us a kind comment and a like in a YouTube video. You can tell a friend. You can pick up some merch at our merch store, and you can join us on Patreon with a little club of people. I say Patreon a lot. I don't know if I've ever described it, but it's just like a membership program. You can go to patreon.com, look us up, and you can join if you wish. That get you signed up for a monthly sort of payment, and recompense for that, you get some certain benefits like early access to episodes, ad-free episodes, behind the scenes content, etc. I mean, we really do depend on that as a way for us to continue making this show. We have to pay for the website, we have to pay for distribution, all of that.
Right.
And so a tremendous amount of thanks goes to the generosity of our amazing patrons, which includes Mike M, Megan, Layla, Mike T, Justin, Kim, Joshua, Brad, Stephanie, Olivia, Brian, and Ashley. Thank you all eternally. You are amazing and the best.
We love you to death.
In addition, this podcast could not happen without my lovely team of people, which includes Justin, who does our audio engineering and production, Shane for all of your work in writing, co-hosting, and really guiding this discussion today. And of course, our social media coordinator is Emma Wilson. And then, of course, thanks to all of my listeners. You guys are amazing, and I appreciate all of you. I think with that, it is time for our final segment here, which is to give our recommendations of the week.
Yay! Love recommendations.
Recommendations.
I'm going to recommend a tattoo shop that I recently went to. It was recently for October. It was Friday the 13th. Sometimes tattoo shops will do really fun events for Friday the 13th.
Indeed.
This shop did this, and it's called Electric Shark Tattoo Studio.
Fun.
This shop is based out of Port Orange, Florida, closer to Edgewater, New Smyrna, that area. So it's kind of moving in that direction. It's actually like right around the corner from where Eileen Warnos was captured. So it's like right down the road from there.
Oh, wild.
Yeah, it's run by a really great artist. His name is Robert, and they did this really fun flash sale for Friday the 13th, and I was able to go in. The shop is clean. They're a lot of fun. It's like an artist shop. It's not like a money shop, which is what I really like. Yeah, it was really great feeling, and the dude was really nice. So I recommend it if you're in the area to go get tattooed by them.
Fantastic. That's great. That was Electric Shark Tattoo Studio. This is in Florida, for those of you looking around for it. Possible they have other locations, but I'm guessing it's just down in Florida.
Yeah, it's right now it's down in Florida, but the guy that runs it also has invented a tattoo machine. So like that's where he also makes like a pretty good chunk of changes, like buying tattoo machines. So if you're in the market for that also exists.
Oh, fantastic. Okay. I am recommending a movie. I think I recommend a lot of movies and TV shows, but I'm going to do that again. So we're ending October here. This is available on Hulu. It is a horror movie called No One Will Save You. Ooh. You could sort of generally classify this sort of in, you know what? I won't spoil anything at all. It is a very unique movie. I think you will have seen something, like it'll have elements of things you've seen before, and it'll also have some things you maybe haven't seen before. But I generally liked it. I thought how incredibly unique it was threw me off a little bit, but I really found it quite enjoyable and really impressive that they pulled it off the way that they did. So yeah, if you're interested in a spooky horror movie for your October scary movie queue of things to watch, you might consider checking out No One Will Save You on Hulu.
Yes, I'm adding it to my list. I can't wait to check it out.
Cool. All right. Well, I think that is all that I have to say. Anything that I forgot or that you would like to add before we wrap up today, Shane?
Do good. Don't do evil.
Do good. Don't do evil. Yeah.
Evildoers beware.
Yes. Have a safe and happy Halloween. I think we'll catch you next time. This is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do.
You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.